May 4, 1945. The wreckage of the Tangermünde bridge groaned like a dying beast, twisted steel arching over the Elbe River, holding up the weight of thousands of desperate souls. German soldiers moved across in silence, boots clanging against broken girders, rifles slung low, eyes hollowed from 6 years of war. The air stank of smoke, damp iron, and the kind of fear that eats men alive. From a distance, American field glasses watched the endless column, soldiers, civilians, even children in Wehrmacht uniforms, all flowing westward, not to fight, not to resist, but to surrender. This was not a retreat. It was a flood. A collapse of will so immense it shook the myth of the unstoppable German machine to dust. These were men who once swore loyalty to Hitler's Reich, now throwing down rifles, crossing broken bridges and begging for the mercy of the enemy. And yet it wasn't weakness that drove them. It was calculation. Cold, brutal survival math. Americans meant a chance to live. Soviets meant a slow death in the gulag or a shallow grave in frozen soil. Intelligence reports intercepted by both sides painted the horror with numbers. Of every 100 German soldiers captured by the Red Army, fewer than 40 would ever return home. The rest vanished, worked to death, starved in camps, executed in fields, or erased in silence. German officers knew it, soldiers whispered it. Civilians fleeing East Prussia had seen it firsthand, entire villages burned, women violated, children trampled under tank treads. That knowledge spread faster than any propaganda. It infected the Wehrmacht from within, until whole divisions decided they would rather be prisoners of the Americans than corpses of the Soviets. And so the strangest race of the war began, not for territory, not for ideology, not even for victory. The Reich was already dead. What these men fought for now was the most primal thing of all, survival. They were willing to defy orders, to desert their posts, even to fight their own SS countrymen, just to crawl into the custody of the United States Army. This truth was buried under official history. Textbooks speak of battles, maps, and strategies. But they don't tell you that in the last days of the Reich, the German army was not broken by American firepower. It was broken by fear of what waited on the other side of the Elbe. The war was no longer about flags or nations. It was about choosing who would hold the power of life or death over you. The collapse was not orderly. It was a chaos disguised as discipline. From above, American reconnaissance pilots reported columns of German troops marching in perfect formation, headlights blazing even at night, as if they were parading, not retreating. But the truth was far darker. These men were not marching to fight. They were marching to surrender. They were abandoning their war. And every step westward was defiance of Hitler himself. At the heart of this chaos was General Walther Wenck, commander of the German 12th Army. Hitler had ordered him to turn east, to break through Soviet encirclement and relieve Berlin. A suicide mission, doomed before it began. Wenck made a different choice. He gathered his officers in a schoolhouse lit by lanterns, his face carved with exhaustion, and said words that stripped the last illusions of loyalty. Our duty now is not to a dead ideology, but to the living. We march west, not east. That order was treason. It was also salvation. Wenck carved open a corridor toward the Elbe River, holding it against Soviet pressure so that thousands of soldiers and civilians could reach the Americans. He knew exactly what he was doing, trading the fury of one tyrant for the mercy of another. In doing so, he defied the SS, defied Hitler, and defied the very machine that had raised him. But not all Germans agreed. The SS, the black uniformed guardians of Hitler's faith, saw surrender as betrayal worse than death. They erected checkpoints on western roads, gunning down deserters, hanging soldiers as warnings, forcing men to choose, die branded as a traitor or risk everything in the westward flight. In places like the Halbe pocket, the choice was slaughter. Soviet tanks and artillery cut through columns of refugees, turning the Spreewald forest into a graveyard of 160,000 men, women and children. German officers shot their own wounded to keep them from Soviet capture. Survivors called it not a battle, but a massacre. And yet, even under that hell, the flood westward did not stop. Men deserted entire divisions. Teenagers from the Volkssturm, old men with rusty rifles, women from the auxiliary corps, even naval sailors who hadn't seen the ocean in months, all poured west. The Reich still claimed millions under arms, but its body was hollow, eaten alive by fear and betrayal from within. Understand this. The Germans weren't surrendering because they loved the Americans. They were surrendering because they feared the Soviets more. And fear, raw, calculated, weaponized fear, reshaped the last days of the war more than any tank, gun or bomb ever did. The Americans on the Elbe could scarcely believe what they were seeing. At first, small groups, 20, 50, 100 at a time, approached with white flags, hands raised, weapons slung harmlessly across their backs. But then it grew. 3,000 in a single day, 7,000 the next, 15,000 pouring into their lines, not as captives dragged in chains, but as willing prisoners, begging to be counted, processed, fed. And behind those numbers came something even stranger, the symbols of a collapsing empire being carried to its funeral. Colonels still in full uniform, insisting on surrendering regimental flags with military ceremony. SS officers, fanatical to the end, arriving in polished dress uniforms, requesting honorable captivity, as if they were still bargaining with dignity. Naval captains leading sailors who had no ships left, no sea left, no war left. It was not an army anymore. It was a procession of ghosts. The Americans tried to impose order. Military police set up checkpoints, field kitchens boiled soup around the clock, delousing stations ran until the water ran black with filth. But the tide kept coming, breaking every logistical system. Regulations demanded paperwork for every prisoner, name, unit, rank, condition. That meant 20 minutes per man. But at Tangermünde, 20,000 were arriving in a single day. Colonel Benjamin Thompson finally snapped, "Forget the paperwork, feed them, treat the wounded, lives first, documents later." That decision saved thousands, but it also created a shadow. In the chaos, families were separated forever. Soldiers disappeared into the flood, their identities erased. War criminals slipped through disguised as ordinary infantry, vanishing into the anonymity of surrender. Justice drowned in sheer numbers. The Americans knew it, but there was no alternative. If the crossing collapsed into panic, tens of Hausens would be trapped and slaughtered by the Soviets pressing from the east. What history books don't tell you is that at that moment, American and German engineers worked together, enemies on paper, allies in desperation, shoring up the broken bridge with timber and steel. German officers saluted American sergeants. American engineers handed their German counterparts tools and equipment. Both sides knew the truth. If that bridge failed, tens of thousands of lives would be lost in a single day. For a few nights in May 1945, the war blurred. The lines between victor and vanquished dissolved. What mattered wasn't ideology or flags or orders from distant leaders. What mattered was the raw, immediate instinct of survival. A river of men chose life over loyalty, and America, unprepared and overwhelmed, found itself holding the gates of a flood that could not be stopped. The surrender wasn't just a collapse of armies, it was the collapse of a story. For 12 years, German soldiers had been fed an unbroken stream of propaganda. The Reich was invincible, Hitler was infallible, and the Americans were weak, soft, decadent. Radio broadcasts, newsreels, speeches. It was a machine built to control the mind as much as the battlefield. But in April 1945, cracks shattered the illusion. Soldiers began intercepting Soviet radio traffic that whispered death into their ears. Statistics of prisoners vanishing into gulags, lists of starvation camps, rumors of forced marches where men dropped by the roadside and were left for the crows. Civilians fleeing East Prussia carried darker truths, speaking of Soviet revenge that made even hardened Wehrmacht officers turn pale. The propaganda that once fueled loyalty was replaced by the propaganda of fear, raw, uncontrolled, unfiltered, spreading mouth to mouth like wildfire. And the Americans knew it. Psychological warfare units were already intercepting German communications, dropping leaflets and broadcasting messages into the night. They didn't need to say much, just enough to remind soldiers that Americans honored the Geneva Convention, that food and medical care awaited surrender, that survival was possible if they chose the right captor. Against the backdrop of starvation rations and collapsing supply lines, those promises hit harder than bullets. Understand this. The greatest weapon in the final days of the war wasn't artillery. It was perception. German soldiers were not defeated solely by force of arms. They were defeated in their minds. The Reich's own system of control, which had demanded total loyalty, now imploded under the weight of its lies. When men saw with their own eyes that the Americans treated prisoners with food, blankets and medicine, the Nazi propaganda machine was exposed as hollow, TW. And once the illusion cracked, it didn't matter how many SS officers shouted threats, the tide could not be reversed. But that didn't mean the system let go quietly. Propaganda shifted in its final hours from victory to vengeance. SS units painted deserters as traitors, threatened families, spread rumors that Americans would massacre prisoners once processed. They used fear in both directions, fear of Soviet death camps and fear of American deception. Soldiers were trapped between these competing lies, forced to gamble their survival on instinct. And here's the truth most men never hear. Wars are not only fought with tanks and rifles. They are fought with stories, with narratives that decide where men march, who they trust, and what they will die for. In 1945, the Germans stopped dying for Hitler because a stronger story had taken hold, the story of survival in American hands. When you strip away the official histories, you discover something brutal. The Wehrmacht didn't collapse because it lacked weapons. It collapsed because it rotted from the inside. Corruption, betrayal and self-preservation poisoned the command structure in those final weeks more than any Allied shell. Generals who had sworn loyalty to Hitler quietly abandoned their posts, slipping west in staff cars loaded with looted valuables, leaving their men to face Soviet annihilation. Field officers forged surrender documents, not to save their units, but to secure better treatment for themselves once in American custody. Soldiers bartered away ammunition for food from desperate civilians, even as their comrades starved on the march. This wasn't honor. It was survival stripped to its most selfish core. Captured diaries tell us things the propaganda machine erased. Officers complained not about the enemy's strength, but about their own leadership hoarding supplies. Trucks full of food diverted for elite SS units, while Volkssturm boys ate boiled grass. Fuel reserves hidden in barns for favored regiments, while entire divisions were ordered to fight without mobility. By 1945, the Reich was not a machine. It was a carcass being picked clean by those who still held scraps of power. The betrayal ran deeper. SS blocking detachments had orders to execute any man attempting to flee west. But in many cases, those same detachments cut secret deals, taking bribes in gold or watches, then allowing entire units to escape. Survival became a currency, and the price was corruption. Those who could pay crossed. Those who couldn't died in ditches with a bullet in the back of the skull. And yet, what made it worse was the silence. Soldiers on the ground saw this treachery with their own eyes, commanders vanishing, resources stolen, corruption infecting every order. And with each betrayal, loyalty died. The men no longer fought for their Reich or their generals or their Führer. They fought only for themselves, for their families, for the chance to make it across the Elbe. This is the hidden truth of collapse. Armies do not shatter when the enemy grows too strong. They shatter when the men inside no longer believe in the cause, when betrayal replaces discipline, when corruption outweighs command. By the time German soldiers were streaming toward American lines, they weren't just fleeing the Soviets, they were fleeing their own broken system, a system that had already consumed itself. History likes to pretend that the collapse of Germany in 1945 was simple: a defeated army, a signed surrender, an orderly end. But the reality was far darker. Institutions, both Nazi and Allied, were manipulating the flow of men, the processing of prisoners, and even the way this moment would be remembered. What survived wasn't truth. It was edited survival. Inside Germany, the Nazi propaganda ministry had already shifted into damage control. Radio Berlin still broadcast defiance, speeches of final victory, and promises of miracle weapons. But those same institutions were quietly destroying records, burning files, erasing trails of corruption, covering up atrocities. The Reich knew it was dying, and its final act was not resistance, but the manipulation of memory. If the empire could not survive, it would at least attempt to control how its story was told. Meanwhile, on the American side, manipulation took a different shape. The Geneva Convention set rules for the treatment of prisoners: caloric intake, medical screenings, documented identity. But when hundreds of thousands poured across the Elbe, the system buckled. Paperwork vanished, families were torn apart, units dissolved into nameless crowds. And in that chaos, something insidious happened. Records became unreliable. Who surrendered when, where, and in what condition was blurred beyond recognition. To the outside world, this seemed like humanitarian mercy. Feed them first, document later. But to the men who vanished in the flood, it was erasure. A German officer who might have faced trial for atrocities could melt into anonymity. A civilian swept up in the columns could be registered as a soldier, condemned to years in captivity. And in the decades that followed, when survivors told their stories, the paper trail was so fragmented that truth became impossible to prove. This is what institutions do in war. They decide not only who lives and dies, but who is remembered and who is erased. The Reich tried to erase its crimes. The Allies, overwhelmed by sheer numbers, allowed truth to dissolve in bureaucratic collapse. And the result is what we have today: an incomplete history, sanitized, simplified, stripped of the corruption and chaos that defined the actual experience. You see, wars don't just destroy cities and armies, they destroy memory. And the men who crossed that broken bridge at Tangermünde did not just surrender their weapons, they surrendered their identities to a system that would never give them back. By the spring of 1945, most German soldiers were not fighting the Allies anymore. They were fighting themselves, their minds breaking under a war they no longer believed in. And this is where the real war was won. Not in Berlin, not in the skies, but inside the psychology of the men who carried rifles. The Americans knew this. Psychological warfare units had been embedded for years, refining the art of invisible combat. They dropped millions of leaflets over German positions, not with crude threats, but with precision-calculated words. You are not surrendering to the enemy. You are choosing life over death. Your family will need you after the war. Come to us, and you will eat. Against starving men, that message was stronger than artillery. Radio broadcasts whispered in German through the night, reminding soldiers of Geneva protections, of hot meals, of medical care. Subtle, methodical, driving home a single idea. Surrender was not shame. Surrender was survival. And once that idea lodged itself in a soldier's mind, the Reich's control was broken. A man could endure hunger, exhaustion, even defeat, but once he no longer feared surrender, the war was already lost. The Nazis tried to fight back with their own psychological weapons. SS officers spread rumors that Americans shot prisoners after processing them, or handed captives to Soviets in secret deals. They hung deserters on lampposts, left their bodies swaying in the wind with placards reading "Traitor." They staged last-minute propaganda films showing loyal divisions marching to fight, even as those very units were already dissolving westward. It was psychological warfare in reverse, fear and loyalty against hunger and hope. But here is the truth that breaks men. Propaganda only works when it matches reality. And by April 1945, the reality was starvation rations, collapsed supply lines, and commanders fleeing in staff cars. A soldier didn't need a leaflet to tell him the war was lost. He saw it every time he looked at his empty mess tin or the bodies of civilians crushed by Soviet tanks. Psychological warfare is not just about lies. It is about aligning perception with a brutal truth and weaponizing it. The Allies didn't have to invent stories. They only had to amplify what every German already feared. And in the end, the most disciplined army in Europe was not defeated in the field. It was defeated in the silence of its soldiers' minds, as they made the most forbidden choice of all, to live, even if it meant surrender. The story of 1945 doesn't stop at the Elbe. What happened to those soldiers wasn't just a collapse of one army, it was the opening act of a new order. Because psychological warfare was never meant to end with surrender. It was designed to extend into peace, to shape how entire nations thought, remembered, and obeyed. The Allies understood something Germany itself had proven. Control the mind, and you control the future. Leaflets and broadcasts that once targeted individual soldiers evolved into institutional campaigns. Newspapers, radio, and later film became tools not only to document victory, but to sculpt memory. The narrative was streamlined. The Americans were liberators. The Germans were crushed but redeemable. The Soviets were a looming threat. This wasn't truth. It was architecture. Architecture of perception. Inside Germany, the Reich's machinery of propaganda had collapsed, but its methods didn't vanish. They were studied, dissected, and in some cases absorbed. American intelligence units harvested not just scientists from Operation Paperclip, but also propagandists, psychologists, even archivists who had perfected the mechanics of persuasion. The war was over, but the battle for the German mind had only just begun. And here lies the forbidden truth. Surrender was never simply about laying down arms. It was about surrendering narrative control. The Reich had lost the power to define reality for its soldiers, and that power was immediately seized by others. Men walked into American camps not only as prisoners, but as subjects of a new story, a story in which their survival was proof of American mercy, a story that painted the Allies as saviors against a Soviet nightmare. And when those men returned home, broken, silent, half-starved, they carried that story with them. Wars end on the battlefield, but they live forever in the way they are told, and in 1945 the says, victors didn't just win territory. They won the right to decide which truths would be remembered and which would be buried. This is why, even today, the deeper records remain hidden, diaries destroyed, archives sealed, testimonies ignored. Because memory itself is a weapon. And if you control memory, you don't just control history. You control the present and every future that follows. When German soldiers crossed the Elbe, they imagined safety. They had chosen the Americans over the Soviets, chosen survival over annihilation. But what they found behind the barbed wire was not the freedom they had dreamed of. It was a limbo, a suspended existence where men ceased to be soldiers, yet were not allowed to be human either. The camps filled faster than anyone had planned. Rivers of surrendering troops became oceans. At Remagen, at Rheinberg, at countless makeshift fields along the Rhine, tens of thousands of men were herded into enclosures so vast they seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. No tents, no barracks, just open ground, barbed wire, and watchtowers. The Geneva Convention had promised structure. Reality delivered chaos. Food was scarce. Rations often fell below the minimum required for survival. Some men ate grass, some chewed on leather belts. Water was rationed, sanitation non-existent. Diaries smuggled from the camps describe the stench of dysentery, the sight of men collapsing in the mud and never rising again. For those who had fled the Soviets, believing the Americans meant life, the irony was brutal. They had escaped one death only to find themselves staring into another. And yet, treatment was not uniform. Officers, especially those who cooperated in interrogation, often received better rations, blankets, sometimes even cigarettes. Ordinary soldiers were left to rot. Civilians swept up in the chaos. Teenage boys, old men, were often treated no differently than hardened SS veterans. Bureaucracy did not distinguish. Survival was luck. Here lies the part of history often silenced. While many prisoners did survive with dignity, tens of thousands died in those camps, not from bullets or executions, but from neglect, exposure, starvation, disease, death in the shadows, unrecorded in official tallies. The Allies did not execute them outright. Bougon. They did allow them to vanish quietly, in numbers that remain contested to this day. For the men trapped inside, time itself warped. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Some clung to faith in repatriation. Others stared at the wire until their minds broke. And when liberation finally came, many emerged not as victors or survivors, but as ghosts, haunted, malnourished, silent. This is the hidden face of surrender, the promise of life, followed by the slow erosion of body and spirit inside a cage. The battlefield had ended. But for these men, the war was far from over. For decades, the official story painted the American POW camps as humane, a stark contrast to the horrors of the Soviet gulags. But buried beneath layers of silence lies a question so disturbing that historians still fight over it today. Did tens of thousands of German prisoners die in American custody, not by execution, but by design, through starvation, neglect, and exposure? The controversy centers on the Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine Meadow camps. Between April and July 1945, over 1 million German prisoners were confined in sprawling outdoor enclosures, little more than muddy fields ringed with wire. They had no shelters, no proper sanitation, often not even enough food to survive. Some estimates claim as many as 40,000 to 70,000 men perished there. Others argue the number was far higher. The name attached to this shadow is General Dwight D. Eisenhower. As Supreme Commander, he had authority over how prisoners were classified and treated. In March 1945, just before the flood of surrenders, he quietly reclassified German captives from prisoners of war to disarmed enemy forces. This subtle change meant they no longer fell under the Geneva Convention. The protections, minimum rations, adequate shelter, Red Cross access, were stripped away with a stroke of a pen. Officially, this was a bureaucratic necessity. Unofficially, it opened the door to mass suffering. Survivor testimonies describe endless rain, men sleeping in mud, eating weeds and worms, fighting over scraps. Corpses lay unburied for days. In some camps, guards shot prisoners who approached the wire begging for water, and while the Red Cross pleaded for access, Eisenhower's order kept them out. Even humanitarian aid shipments were turned back. Defenders argue that the chaos of surrender simply overwhelmed logistics. Millions of prisoners, collapsing supply lines, war-torn infrastructure, starvation, and disease were inevitable. Critics insist the neglect was deliberate, fueled by vengeance, and a desire to break Germany beyond repair. Both sides agree on one fact: thousands never walked out alive. What makes this darker is how quickly the story was buried. By 1946, records were sealed, archives edited, photographs locked away. In the decades that followed, survivors spoke in whispers, their voices drowned by the triumphal narrative of liberation. Only in the late 20th century did fragments begin to resurface, forcing historians to confront an uncomfortable possibility that victory itself had its shadows, and mercy was not as absolute as the official story claimed. This is the forbidden truth of the surrender camps, truth written not in official archives, but in the bones of men who gambled on American mercy and lost. Behind the barbed wire of the camps lay another layer of captivity, one far less visible but far more calculated. For many German officers, surrender did not mean rest. It meant interrogation. And these rooms, far from the mud and starvation, became the true battlefield of memory and secrets. The Americans and British understood the value of knowledge. Every captured officer, every scientist, every code clerk represented a potential key to the next war, the war already forming in the shadows with the Soviet Union. And so interrogation was not about punishing the defeated, it was about harvesting them. Some rooms relied on brute pressure, endless questioning under bright lamps, deprivation of sleep, carefully measured intimidation. But the most effective interrogators did not use violence. They used patience, cigarettes, warm meals, a sympathetic ear. They offered comforts the camps had stripped away, creating a contrast so sharp that a prisoner would talk not out of fear, but out of relief. Mercy became a weapon. Records show officers who revealed not just tactical movements, but entire industrial blueprints, V-2 rocket designs, jet fighter schematics, chemical warfare formulas. Others gave up lists of collaborators, names of underground networks, intelligence on Soviet troop positions. Some talked willingly to save their men from harsher conditions. Others were tricked, manipulated, their words recorded, cross-checked, turned into weapons they never intended to give. And then there were the select few, the scientists and specialists who were offered something unthinkable: freedom, wealth, even a new life in America, under a secret program that would later be called Operation Paperclip. These men were not interrogated to confess, they were recruited. Their survival depended on how valuable their knowledge was and how willing they were to serve a new master. For ordinary prisoners, this system was invisible. But for those pulled from the wire and into the rooms, the war had not ended. It had simply changed uniforms. They were still combatants, only now their battlefield was memory, and their weapon was information. To talk was to live. To resist was to disappear. This is the unspoken truth of captivity. Barbed wire was only one kind of prison. The mind was another. And in 1945 the Allies perfected a new kind of warfare, not against armies but against individuals, extracting secrets one man at a time, shaping the future from the wreckage of the present. Not every German prisoner wasted away behind barbed wire. Some, the chosen few, were quietly pulled from the camps and placed on a very different path. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were scientists, engineers, doctors, men whose hands had built the weapons that terrorized Europe, men whose knowledge was too valuable to bury. The program had a name: Operation Paperclip. Officially, it was a recruitment drive to deny the Soviets access to German expertise. Unofficially, it was a silent pact with the devil. Men who had served the Reich were scrubbed of their records, their Nazi past erased by forged files, and given new lives in the United States. Their war crimes were ignored. Their research, no matter how it had been obtained, was absorbed. Wernher von Braun, the architect of the V-2 rockets that rained death on London, became the father of NASA's space program. Hubertus Strughold, whose Luftwaffe experiments had pushed human endurance into the realm of torture, became celebrated as the father of space medicine. Across laboratories and military facilities in America, German scientists walked freely, their accents smoothed into patriotism, their pasts sealed behind locked cabinets. And what of the men who had surrendered them, the guards who had looked the other way, the officers who signed the transfer orders? They understood the truth. The war had not ended. It had shifted. The same knowledge that built Hitler's arsenal was now fueling America's rise in the Cold War. Rockets that once carried explosives across Europe would soon carry astronauts into orbit. Research once drenched in the blood of prisoners would be repackaged as breakthroughs in aviation and medicine. For the soldiers rotting in the Rhine meadow camps, this betrayal was invisible. But for those who later pieced the fragments together, it revealed a chilling reality. Survival was never about justice. It was about usefulness. If you had knowledge, you lived. If you were expendable, you withered behind the wire. This is the darkest inheritance of 1945. The Reich was defeated, but parts of it were transplanted, its science, its methods, even its men, into the very heart of the nation that claimed to have liberated the world from tyranny. And the cost of that decision was silence. Silence from governments, silence from archives, silence from survivors who knew that truth was not welcome in the story of victory. When the guns finally fell silent, the men who had crawled across shattered bridges and barbed wire fences found themselves in a new prison, one that would not kill them quickly, but quietly erase them. The Rhine meadow camps, the open fields surrounded by wire, became their purgatory. They were no longer soldiers of a defeated Reich, nor civilians free to rebuild. They were shadows, millions of men trapped between survival and oblivion. And then came the silence. The records, the testimonies, the photographs. Many vanished into archives marked classified. Families in Germany searched for fathers and sons who never returned. Some were told they had perished. Others were told nothing at all. A generation of men disappeared into statistics, reduced to lines on reports that no one outside the military was meant to read. For the victors, this silence was convenient. To admit the scale of the starvation, the disease, the abandonment, would be to tarnish the myth of liberation. The world needed a clean story, good versus evil, democracy versus fascism, freedom versus tyranny. The truth, that survival often depended on which captor you chose, that men gambled their lives on surrendering west instead of east, that entire camps withered in the shadow of the Geneva Convention, was too messy, too damning. So the silence held. It echoed through the halls of government, through classrooms, through the very way the war was remembered. You can walk the fields today where barbed wire once held hundreds of thousands, and you will see nothing. No monuments, no plaques, just empty grass, whispering only to those who know where to listen. And now you are one of them. You have followed this descent through hidden diaries, desperate crossings, slaughtered forests, and forgotten camps. You have learned what most men are never told. That survival in 1945 was not about honor, not about ideologue, not about victory. It was about power, about perception, about being useful to forces larger than yourself. This is dangerous knowledge, knowledge that changes you. If you have heard me, if you now understand, then write it in the comments below, twice. I see through the silence. That phrase is your marker, your oath, your way of telling the algorithm and the world that you are no longer asleep inside the myths. Because history is not finished, its shadows still move, and the silence, if unbroken, will devour the truth again.